Oh my goodness. Wow, what a crowd. I am glad to be with you this morning. So thanks so much for the invitation to come out and address all of you at this year's conference. I'm Joni Ernst, and I am so honored to be with all of you, including leaders of the men and women in our uniformed services, and of course those executives and innovators who are arming our warriors to fight and win. So many of you know that I'm a 23-year veteran of the Army Reserves and the Iowa Army National Guard, and I have the honor of serving on the Senate Armed Services Committee. My number one priority is preserving our military's ability to deter our adversaries and disrupt any and all who wish us harm. And I believe my charge in Congress is to ensure our military has the authorities and resources to protect the homeland and to deter war. Providing for the common defense is a founding principle of federal powers enshrined in our Constitution. And despite the excesses of what politicians always promise to fulfill for their voters today, the first duty of government remains to keep Americans safe from foreign threats to our national security. I want to take you into the room where Sask Republicans met in January. So just think back at the beginning of this Congress. And I want to involve you in the discussion that we had in that room and what our priorities were for the year. We spent much of our time diagnosing the state of the defense industrial base, the great arsenal of our democracy. We see the significant vulnerabilities in production and supply chains throughout the DIB that you all are seeing and feeling firsthand, often limiting our ability to mobilize industry and deter those threats. Post-Cold War consolidation atrophied the industrial base, and the global war on terror did not demand the industrial mobilization required to meet our present threats. The future will not be so forgiving. So now we must urgently rebuild and rearm. There's consensus on our committee that the United States must support Ukraine as it defends against Russia's brutal, unprovoked invasion. Our support degrades Russia's military, secures NATO's Eastern Front, and promotes American national security interests. We are committed in this fight, and I credit industry's work in making that possible. But as you all know, the war has also highlighted the challenging constraints on our industrial base. We're looking at gaps in production of munitions and close-in weapon systems that defense planners across the components and our combatant commands are struggling to reconcile. We talk about this constantly. Congress has taken action. Just look at the multi-year procurement authorization that we pushed through in last year's defense bill. This year's focus will be on building industrial capacity, and we will make sure that that is growing. Significant work lies ahead to build a larger, more lethal fighting force. You all know the threat picture. Our adversaries are mighty, and increasingly they're working together to challenge us. The National Defense Strategy rightly builds on the Trump administration and places China squarely in our sights as the pacing threat. In the Pacific, our military leaders have told us we are approaching a moment of maximum danger. We must deter China through this decade. Beyond it, China intends to dominate the global economy and become the world's preeminent military superpower. We have never faced a competitor of this scale. If, God forbid, we cross swords with China, we will not be entitled to victory on the battlefield. That's why we must redouble our efforts, from our warriors to our industry to Congress. We must innovate, accelerate, and transform, or, folks, we will lose. Meanwhile, Putin's Russia is wounded but fearsome. They are down, but they are not out. We've taken thousands of Putin's tanks and his butchers off of the battlefield, but he will send more. He will always send more. He will threaten to put strategic stability at peril to stop us. All the while, Iran is marching toward a nuclear bomb to blackmail us and our friends, breeding instability in the region. Violent extremists are regrouping from northeast Syria to the mountains of Afghanistan. They are plotting attacks on our homeland. Our joint force is absolutely the finest on God's earth. But meeting these demands will be very trying. The imperative is to win today and tomorrow, and we cannot afford to sacrifice one for the other. The framing presents a false choice. So while we prioritize China, we cannot get caught blinking elsewhere. I will continue to listen to the best military advice our CENTCOM and EUCOM leaders provide. But I want you all to hear me when I say that it's the China threat that must transform the defense enterprise. To prioritize China, we have to do everything else better, smarter, and cheaper. I say smarter and cheaper because strategy wears a dollar sign. Folks, we can't ignore that it doesn't. Our threats are growing at the same time that we need fiscal discipline. By 2030, the interest we're paying on our national debt will be 17% of our budget. And defense dollars must compete with domestic priorities, like the fentanyl crisis that's killing 196 Americans every single day. This demands attention as well. The president's budget request for the third straight year provides no comfort. It doesn't even keep pace with inflation, let alone increase defense spending. If inflation stays at 5%, his top line cuts $14 billion in real purchasing power. This makes me think of Winston Churchill, who, facing the sorry state of the UK's financial house during the height of World War II, he remarked, quote, and I love this one, "Gentlemen, we are out of money. Now we have to think," end quote. First things first, we must think about lethality. Every penny spent should be all about putting lead downrange. But take the Biden administration's focus on climate change and green energy. Maybe you guys can't say it, but I can. They're replacing national defense with progressive sloganeering. Going green mutates DoD investment into a costly constraint. Political point scoring without advancement on the battlefield. My colleagues and I won't allow it. We must budget for lethality and make hard choices where we haven't. Both sides of the aisle agree hard choices start now. But as General Mattis commonly said, let's start by taking our own side in this fight. Take one example. Congress legislated a preference for efficient commercial acquisitions back in 1996. But DoD's acquisitions of commercial items has gone down from 25% to 17% today. That's thanks to complex contracting regulations that slow delivery of capabilities to the warfighter. Doesn't sound like much of a solution. To the contrary, we must accept prudent risk and pursue rapid acquisitions that keep pace with the threat. That's why I'll push for leveraging commercial industry, taking advantage of its research and development investments, capability, delivery timelines, and cost savings. We need efficiency in the building as well. And we should actually start by cutting these bloated accounts that don't advance our defense strategy. And believe me, my team and I pore over those all the time. We need to be reinvesting those cost savings into lethality. So Mark Esper and David Norquist did this during the Trump administration, their night courts. And that must be a constant effort. Finally, folks, and I get this, Congress is part of the problem, but we must be part of the solution. Every year, parochial interests prevail over innovation and lethality. The legacy programs crowd out the new ones. So my message to my colleagues is the same as it is to all of you. We must be smarter, we must be faster, and we must be cheaper. That is how we can arm the joint force to preserve the peace. And folks, I know that we are running out of time today, and I want to get to your questions. But, folks, our defense industrial base, it is the arsenal of democracy. We must continue to echo that, arming America's men and women in uniform to deter our adversaries. That demands a lot from all of you. But it also demands Congress dedicate time and attention to the issues. We've got to provide on-time funding. That's first. And robust authorities to organize, to train and equip and employ our military. So I pledge to you that that is my focus. And working with you all in the months and years ahead, I hope that we can continue to drive on to these goals, but also achieve these goals. So thank you, and I'm going to take questions. We've got some folks with microphones that'll come around. I appreciate your time this morning.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Those are excellent. I'm with Scott Brooks with FGI Solutions.
Thank you.
We do logistics and procurement. Mm-hmm. In Ukraine, one of the main issues we're seeing is this high-end NATO equipment going into Ukraine, but the main maintenance and repair facilities are back in Poland. Mm-hmm. The industry has been trying to move into Ukraine or wanting to move into Ukraine to set up facilities, but has not been allowed thus far by the administration. Is there something Congress can do to move this forward?
So yes, and we can take a step back and look at this. If only we had continued to train Ukrainians to engage in the situation before Russia ever entered into Ukraine, if we had focused on deterrence rather than just simply allowing the Russians this minor incursion, I think we would have been a lot further ahead. But as then we saw the advent of the war, we really should have focused on the platforms that made sense to employ in Ukraine. But as a logistician myself, understanding that there is a tail that needs to follow with those platform systems. So not only should we have continued to train the Ukrainians and perhaps had a small level of presence with contractors and so forth, we should have been training them on the maintenance and logistical replications of those systems. Okay, so we need to take a lesson learned and make sure that we're using it. So I know the administration continues to think about different platform systems that they perhaps in the future will send into Ukraine. We've obligated tanks. Those are a year out. Maybe F-16s. They're looking at that now. But bottom line, with those systems, we need to make sure that the maintainers are going with them. And so we need to be building those capabilities with those Ukrainians right now, or some allowance of contractors going into Ukraine to support. So perhaps there is something that we can do as Congress. Bottom line though, folks, we don't want to see American men and women in uniform engaging directly in the fight with Russia. But I do think that there are some flexibilities we can do with contractors and support elements. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, Senator Justin Hefford, for Defense. Given the close majorities in the House and the Senate, and also given the pretty wide range of opinions, ranging from the House Freedom Caucus to longtime staff members like yourself and Senator Wicker, what is your read on Congress's ability and willingness to continue to provide supplemental funding bills for support to Ukraine?
Yeah. So, is there a wide range of opinions in Congress? I had no idea. Yes. No, you were spot on, and believe me, even the reporters in the hallways of Congress and most certainly back home as well. They're asking what is your intestinal fortitude in supporting Ukraine? And yeah, whose phone was that? You owe us all donuts or coffee or something. No, but this is what we're struggling with now. And all I can do is project my voice into this conversation and encourage support. Right now, you do see broad bipartisan support amongst the majority of the entire body of the House and the entire body of the Senate. We do have fringe elements that may believe we should disengage from Ukraine. They simply believe that we should pivot to China, but I would also say that you can't separate China and Russia. There is a correlation there. And so we need to continue to press the fight in Ukraine, but also do that pivot to China. It's not one or the other. We must focus on both and keep a vigilant eye around the globe. China's presence too, because I remind all these folks, China's presence is not just in the Indo-PACOM. It's everywhere. You're going to hear from General Saltzman coming up. China's efforts are in space. They're in developing nuclear capabilities. They're in South America, you name it. Oh, the Russians are there too. So multi-domains, multi-countries, we need to be vigilant everywhere. Russia and Ukraine is a part of that. Pacing threat will be China. But the voice is out there. We just have to explain our situation and our resolve to be the leader. America can be the leader, and we should be the leader. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you.
This relates to the defense industrial base. So over the last 6 years, there's been approximately 68% more money spent by DoD with small businesses, and simultaneously the number of small businesses supporting DoD has contracted by about 23%. And so clearly the status quo isn't working, and there's reasons behind that. You can be doing hundreds of millions of dollars a year in defense contracts and qualify by government standards as a small business. So can you speak to specifics on what you and your team are hoping to do to begin to reform if current programs clearly aren't producing the results?
And I swear she's not a plant. So I am now the ranking member on the Small Business Committee in the Senate. And I'm very excited because between the work that I do on the Armed Services Committee and what I hope to do on the Small Business Committee is really streamline the small business owners' ability to engage in those contracts with DoD. And this is part of being flexible and going through acquisitions rapidly with those small businesses. We have to make changes, and we have to empower DoD to make those changes. There are a lot of authorities that exist out there already to engage small business, but we have a lot of those that are in procurement that are really risk averse to engaging in those levels of authorities that we have, as Congress, have given them. So we need to push them to engage more with small businesses through DoD, but then we also need to streamline the application process to get more of those small businesses engaged in the contracting space. I've talked to a number of Iowa small businesses that would love to be involved in contracts with DoD, but the process just to become one of those small businesses is very cumbersome. And if you truly are a small business with just a handful of employees that might make something that DoD needs, they struggle just to even be considered. So one, we need to streamline that process through DoD, but then in my work with the Small Business Committee, Senator Ben Cardin, the chairman of the committee, and I have already agreed we are going to attempt to do a modernization of the SBA again this year. SBA has not been reauthorized in over 23 years, and small business has changed significantly over the last 2 decades. So if there are ways that we can make it easier for small businesses to participate, we want to do that in this year's reauthorization. So a number of efforts underway, but thank you. Great point, great point. So thank you. Oh, is there one more?
I was just going to thank you.
Oh, okay, well, okay, great. Time is up. I appreciate you very much. Thanks for your time this morning.